So, how do you resolve or assess conflicting fact claims? The first thing that Vaughan tells you to do is to think about it in terms of background information that you have. And on page 109, he has, as an example, the sentence, "Some babies can bench press a 500-pound weight." Do you have background information that would lead you to doubt that? Sure. So if you have background information that gives you a good reason to doubt a fact claim, then you should doubt it. The problem with Vaughan's advice here and his example is that most of the fact claims that you confront aren't that simple. Obviously, the fact claim that I gave you that was false was about the hypersonic elephant, right? I threw in the 14 guitars because it's an embarrassingly large number of guitars, and you might have thought, whoa, 14 guitars is a crazy number of guitars, and it might have thrown you just because of that. But then there's no such thing as hypersonic elephants, and that's the one you should have not believed. Most of the things we really have to have some concern about believing or not believing are much more complex than babies lifting 500-pound weights. Except that some of the things that people fall into believing are about as believable as babies lifting 500-pound weights, it seems. At least it seems so to me. I will try not to be flippant about it, but sometimes I'm flippant. Because, as Vaughan says in 110, and notice the contradiction of his advice here, it's always possible that the claim is true and our background information is erroneous. So, first he says, if you've got background information that says that the claim is false, then don't believe it. And then he says, but your background information could be false, and the claim could be true. Well, what the hell, man? I thought you were giving us critical thinking skills so that we wouldn't fall into this trap. So I return you to my prior advice. If you've got conflicting claims, or a claim that is doubtful, don't believe anything about it until you have good reasons to draw some kind of conclusion about it, to believe one way or another about it. You know, except in the ridiculous cases of babies bench pressing 500 pounds. How often do people come up to you and try to get you to believe things like that? Advertisements aside. Then, on page 110, Vaughan tells you something that I think does make more sense. He says, it's not reasonable to believe a claim when there's no good reason for doing so. Solid. I'm going to repeat it. He says, it's not reasonable to believe a claim when there is no good reason for doing so. What's a good reason for doing so? An expert tells you so. You've done your own research on it, and you've found the conclusion to be solid. Things like that. It fits into a picture of the world that's coherent. So, one very good possibility of how to resolve these claims is to look at what experts and good authorities say. So what's an expert? I am. I'm an expert. What am I an expert on? A couple things. I'm an expert in philosophy. I have a PhD in philosophy. So an expert, as he says on page 110, talking about what makes an expert, they generally have some kind of knowledge based on study and experience. And generally speaking, there is some kind of credentialing process. In other words, they have an advanced degree. They have a PhD, they've got an MD, they've got a JD for law, something like that. Why is that important? They have access to information that we sometimes don't. In philosophy, in the case of philosophy, I don't have access to information you don't. But what I do have is the other part, he says. Experts understand it better than we do. And a lot of that comes from the study and the experience. The difference between you and me when it comes to philosophy is that I've spent the last 35 years studying philosophy, and I'm still studying philosophy. I spent a couple hours today reading philosophy, not even related to anything that I'm teaching right now. I kind of just can't help it. I love doing it. I'm still learning more stuff about philosophy. The more I do it, the more I know, and the more I want to know, and it keeps me expert. So if you wanted to ask me a question about philosophy of various kinds, I would be able to give you an answer that was probably pretty reliable. If you wanted to ask me a question about fixing a dishwasher, no. I have some expertise about men's professional, North American professional ice hockey. A kind of embarrassingly large amount of trivial information about National Hockey League hockey over the last 20 years especially, because I'm a big hockey fan. But, you know, airplane maintenance? Nope. Second thing he tells us about experts is, what do we do when the experts disagree with each other? Yeah, that's tough. If the experts disagree, we can't believe either of them. This is tricky. How many experts do you need to consult? How many experts is enough experts? How much disagreement is enough disagreement? Lately, we've seen Donald Trump and Anthony Fauci disagreeing with one another about how to prepare for and how to fight the COVID virus. This is not a disagreement between two experts. Only one of these two men is an expert on epidemiology, and that's Anthony Fauci. He's the expert on epidemiology. But when experts really do disagree, we should doubt them. Now, I have a couple examples about disagreement among experts to try to illustrate when this is and when this isn't a problem. My first example is about ecology and climate change. Now, you might know this. I think it's a pretty well-known fact that something like 98% of climate scientists, right, scientists whose expertise is directly about climate, agree that the world's climate is changing and agree that the climate is changing in part because of human activity, and that includes especially burning fossil fuels for energy, and that climate change is creating disastrous consequences, especially for human civilization. About 98%. So there are 2% of climate scientists who don't agree with some or all of those conclusions. And there are other scientists in other fields, not directly related to climate, who disagree about climate change too. So, whose opinion is best informed, best reasoned, most knowledgeable? Right? There's disagreement among the experts. But in the case like this, it's important that the overwhelming balance of opinion, and this is informed expert opinion, is on the idea that there is climate change, we do make it happen, that fossil fuel burning is related to it, and that there are dire consequences of it. The fact that 98% are in agreement about those facts, at least, is sufficient to suggest that that's probably the right opinion to have about it. Compare it this way. I think this metaphor or this analogy will work. Imagine that there's disagreement among dentists about how to deal with tooth decay. There probably is. Let's say that 98% of dentists think that what you should do with a decaying tooth is you should, drill the part that's decayed and then fill it with some amalgam or something that then hardens, and then you can use it to chew and whatever. But there's 2% of dentists who don't think you should do that. They have some other idea. They think you should, I don't know what they think, but, or maybe they don't believe in tooth decay at all. They're on the fringe for sure, and they recognize that they are, but they really sincerely don't believe the 98% of dentists who think that tooth decay has to be fought this way. I know which dentist I'm going to. Another example of this is about the very fringe belief that measles vaccinations are tied to autism in young children. We talked about this briefly. There's a mention of it in the textbook. There's no basis for this, in fact. None. None at all. Yet there's still this pervading rumor about it. There might be somewhere a pediatrician who thinks that it is true. But that person's wrong. So the fact that there's disagreement, even among experts, doesn't necessarily mean that one side is not right. So then he moves on to this next issue about using authorities as a way of resolving disputes. First, he tells you, go to an authority on the issue. That's good advice. But there's a problem with going to authorities that's sometimes called the fallacy of appeal to authority. It's appeal to unqualified authority is really what the fallacy is called. He divides it into two types that he calls type 1 and type 2. I'll keep his numbering. So there's two problems of appeal to authority as he talks about it on page 111 and 112. The first type of the appeal to fallacious authority or unqualified authority is an authority outside of your field. So some detractors to climate change, for instance, are scientists, but they're not climate scientists. They're chemists or something whose main specialization in chemistry has nothing to do with climate. Great, you're a chemist, you do good chemistry. It doesn't mean you're an expert on everything in science. I'm a doctor. I am a doctor, but you shouldn't come and tell me about your medical problems. I'm not that kind of doctor. The second part, or the second type of appeal to unqualified authority, is you're not even appealing to expert authority. You're treating non-experts as experts. One of the most important sources of the whole measles vaccine controversy was a celebrity who I think was a true believer in the whole measles vaccine problem and really pushed it. And people were believing this celebrity. Why do we believe celebrities? They don't know things just because they're celebrities. A sports star isn't more knowledgeable necessarily about anything just because they're a sports star. And the fact that they tell you so in an ad doesn't make it so. Duh, we know that. And yet somehow it works in the back of our minds somehow, and we slip into believing them weirdly. And there's another kind of non-expert that we treat as an expert, the internet. We treat the internet, the whole frickin' internet, as though, well, it was on the internet. I used to deliberately put false things on the internet just for kicks. I found way back when somebody citing something I put on the internet just intentionally to put something false on the internet as though it was something that I actually believed. I did it on purpose. You know this probably already. You can find web pages devoted to any kind of bizarre conspiracy fantasy that you wanted to think of. If you can imagine it, there's a web page for it. Things that you can't unsee later on but would like to. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. And so people that have a view and they want affirmation of it, they can go to the internet and find affirmation of it. That's not good information. They're appealing to a false authority, a non-expert. So how do you identify a credible expert? Go back to what's an expert. Advanced degrees, PhD, a JD for law, MD for medicine. I think that begs the question, do they ever give doctorate degrees to dummies? Sure. Every once in a while, morons get PhDs, but not that often. And some people with PhDs or medical doctorates or Juris Doctorates have no integrity. As researchers, they'll research something or they'll publish something just because somebody pays them to. There's a very famous case of a researcher who was paid by the salt industry to edit a diet journal, a journal of the Dietitians Society. And the whole journal was dedicated to new studies, all of which were funded by the salt industry, and all of which concluded that, salt's not a problem in your diet. It was later discovered that all of these articles in this medical journal were funded by the salt industry, and that the guy who was editing that issue of the journal was getting paid directly by the same industry. No integrity at all. It's just a sellout. So there are people like that. Well, Vaughn's suggestion is that you kind of have to do your own research on these experts. Are they biased? Do they have integrity? What kinds of things do they publish? What's their reputation in their field? Oh man, it turns out that if you want to know the facts and know that you have a reliable source to back up your facts, you have to do your own research. Yeah, sorry kids, but that's the way it is. Sometimes you can find a little cadre of reliable sources. For instance, the New York Times. I know the president hates the New York Times. The New York Times is a reliable source of news. The reason the New York Times is a reliable source of news is they need to be. The only thing that keeps the New York Times as the most important, the most elite, the top newspaper in the world is their own reputation. When they make a mistake, when they get facts wrong, when they report something incorrectly, they have to correct it. Because if they don't get it right, they lose their reputation. And reputation is all they have to maintain their status. That's all they've got. So they have a very direct interest of their own in always correcting themselves. And so they put a lot of resources into making sure that their research is done properly on their stories. They're one of very few newspapers left in the United States that have the money to put into doing research for news stories. They, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, to a lesser extent, the Washington Post, they're about it. Another problem with sources is that they can have biased opinions, but everybody has a bias. Experts are trained to be objective and impartial regarding conclusions in our own fields, but we can't be, because no one can be. We're human beings. Just having a perspective is part of being a human being. So how that can enter into being biased can be really tricky. You can develop an affinity for a certain way of looking at things, or you can, over the years, have an approach to your field that has just been the way you've looked at your field for a long time. Like, this is your theoretical way of doing things. I just had my philosophical approach to doing things kind of shaken down to the core recently. It's kind of tragic and fascinating. Now I don't know what to think about anything in philosophy anymore. So it's kind of exciting, but a little nerve-wracking. Everything that I thought I believed about philosophy is up in the air now. And I realized that all along, I wasn't being very objective about anything that I thought about philosophy. I definitely had developed a very hardcore bias about philosophy. And now I'm starting over again, in a way. But the biases that he's talking about are biases that would lead you as a layperson, as somebody coming to us for advice, lead you astray. And that's not the kind of thing I'm talking about just now. Like, if you ask me about an interpretation of a philosopher, he's talking more about big time problems. A biased source of information would give you incorrect information. There's an interesting sentence where he talks about this. At the very bottom of that page, I believe it is page 112, he says, it's next to last sentence on the page. Oh no, it can't be, it's 113, sorry. Any blatant violation of the critical thinking principles discussed in this text, for example, would give us good reason to question an authority's reliability. Let me repeat that. Second to last sentence on page 113. Any blatant violation of the critical thinking principles discussed in this text, for example, would give us good reason to question an authority's reliability. I've pointed out to you, and I've seen some other blatant violations that Vaughan has made of good critical thinking principles. We're not reading his chapter about critical thinking about science for that very reason. It's incredibly biased. There's some terrible terrible things in that chapter. Last thing about this, about expert opinion. One of the things that can bias people is what's called conflict of interest. Now, conflict of interest is when you have something to gain by skewing your own research. That researcher I mentioned earlier who was being paid by the salt industry, that's a classic conflict of interest. He was paid by them to skew the results of this research. So he got paid for it. That's the conflict of interest. He was getting paid to make his results good for them. Drug companies like to do this sometimes, etc. It's very hard to get away with that anymore. When that particular thing, that event that I was describing earlier, when that happened, medical journals and scientific journals really cut down on the possibility of conflict of interest. And I think it's very hard now to publish anything if you've got a conflict of interest. Vaughan talks about the problem of using evidence from personal experience. I'm going to skip this section because evidence from personal experience is just terrible. We're bad witnesses, even in our own experience. We don't remember things well. We don't perceive things well. Our own perceptions are terribly biased. All of the time, by our own interests, everything. I'm not telling you not to trust your senses. What I'm telling you is you can't reliably know enough about what's going on in your own experience, that your own experience is rich enough to give you enough evidence, enough data to draw a conclusion from it. When he talks about innumeracy and probability, the big takeaway there is we're bad at thinking about probability. We are. We're terrible at it. When he talks about advertising and persuasion, I'm not going to say anything much about this topic. I'm not sure why it's really here. Advertising claims don't really have much to do with facts. Most advertising doesn't try to persuade us using fact and opinion or argument. So it seems really out of place to try to use critical thinking to think about advertising. I think advertising tries and succeeds in making critical thinking about it impossible. I'm going to devote some additional resources to evaluating the internet and other sources. That's a whole big, huge topic that sometimes goes under the topic of information literacy, and it's way too big to be included with this.